I'm going to go and have a look what this looks like in my real rendered view, what the lights look like when they're added to it, because the project comes with lights and I just want to have a look what this looks like. This is really good to see like an unlit view, so you see pretty much everything, but the moment you switch over to the lit view, you'll see that things are much darker. So it's going to be very difficult for me to position any objects. It's a nice creepy mood, but it's probably not the mood I want, because if I put a character in here, I can barely see where they are, what they're doing. So we're going to have to make some adjustments here. Now, working with a scene that brings its own lights, you're well advised to have a look at where are they, what are they, and what do they bring to the table. Is this the look and feel that you want? So under the lights section here, thankfully, the developer has grouped all these things together, and it's a good idea to do that. You can go and switch these off and have a look what they do. You can then go and change the intensity of all of them. But even if we switch everything off, you can still see that there's a little bit of light left in there. There's also this clock face that's illuminated, and of course, assuming that these are all the lights now that we've disabled, these lights come from somewhere else. So this here in the background, that is done with a HDRI. I'll show you how to use that, how to increase that, how to swap that out, how to change that. And the other things are emissive surfaces. So those are well set, I have to say. Emissive surfaces should really not be used for illuminating your scene. So often you think, well, wouldn't it be nice if I see an actual light that comes from this clock face? So I'm going to crank this up to like, I don't know, 100,000. And that while that will in fact appear to light up your scene, it'll also provide a lot of grain. So that isn't what we want either. So just something to remember. I'll go switch all these lights on because none of them give me a strong light. I suppose this one here, that's the sunlight, that's the directional light. If I go to switch to my light item here, I'm going to go take my face away just for a second, just so that you can see what I'm doing here. The strength, you can have a look at that. You can go and crank that up and see if that does anything that you want. This it probably isn't the look and feel we want. It also, the slider tops out at 10, but if you wanted to have something stronger, then just put 50 or put something, type a number in that you feel is a good idea. I think this isn't going to be good, so I'll go and leave it where it was, but 2.6 here. Angle, also that shows you the elevation of the sunlight. Once again, I'm going to leave that at the default because I sort of like that. And we're going to go and have a look at the HDRI next. So HDRI, much like in DAZ Studio, is a bit of a tricky one to wrap your head around, just in case you don't know what that is. It's a sort of a virtual sphere around your set, so sets in the middle and the virtual spheres on the outside, so fairly large, fairly far away, and we should never touch it or see it, but there's an image projected on the inside of the sphere, and that projects onto the inside of your scene, and that is creating the light. In Blender, we access this by going to the shading tab here, where you usually see things that are related to your surfaces. And of course, to see the proper effect of this, we also have to go and switch to the viewport shading, the shaded mode here. And then down here, we're going to switch from object to world. And that shows us that there is in fact a HDRI set up here. The orange box here, that is an actual texture node. That shows us this is it. This is the image that we're using as the HDRI. So ATM HDRI sky. If you want to see what that looks like as a flat image, let's use the image editor here and go and have a look at that. And this is what that is. So this is these are the clouds that we see here, but not just the clouds. This is a nice image because it's very flexible and it doesn't have any buildings in it or stuff that would interfere with just generating lights and nice background here. So that's what it looks like. And this is what's projected on the inside of the sphere, and that's what we see in the background here. There is an option, the green box here under background, that gives us the strength of this. I can see that he's mixed that in with a little color here so that the blue is being taken away and made a bit muter. And then in the green box here, it says the background, and that's the actual strength of the HDRI. If I go and crank that up, you can see what happens. It's almost like we're looking at a daylight scene now. So quite nice what the character of the HDRI brings to the scene. So if you wanted to make that a little bit lighter or brighter, the HDRI is actually doing that for you. There's something else that you can do, and that is the rotation of the sphere so that we're showing a different part on the relevant portion of your image. And we can do that on the mapping node here. HDRI is a little bit tricky to set up here. So the texture coordinate is something that you generate, then you put it into the mapping node, and then you put the output of that into the actual texture node. And that means you can now fiddle with the coordinates of that sphere. So the Z rotation is what rotates that around. And if you wanted to see a different part of the clouds in the sky, made it look a little bit more darker or more ominous or whatever, you can totally do that. So play around with that. You can, of course, also, instead of just using the Z rotation, you can also use the X and Y rotation if ever you needed to do that. So that's here on X and Y respectively. I'll go and put that back to the, oops, I'll go put that back to the default here. So X rotation would do this to the sphere. Probably not what we want, but you can do that. So you can literally show the bottom of the HDRI upside down if you want to do that, or also the Y rotation. So it's essentially like rotating the sphere around here. So I sort of liked it with a few darker clouds and maybe a few stars in the background, and then also go and change my intensity a little bit so that I get a little bit more base lighting in here rather than the default, which was, I think, a little bit too dark. So maybe I'll go and have something like this here. But you know, to be decided. You can play around with it and see how you feel about it. Now, one other thing that comes into play when you look at a scene like this is the render engine, of course, and the same principles apply in both Eevee as well as Cycles. But right now we're looking at Eevee, and that, while that looks okay, Cycles looks a whole lot better. So on the render option here, you can change that from Eevee down to Cycles. That takes a moment, not to compile the shaders, but to do the initial render. I also want to do, instead of the CPU, I'm going to use my GPU. That works a lot faster. This means that the GPU has to compile the kernel when you run it for the first time. It's one of those things. But yeah, there we go. So now we can see that my scene still looks pretty dark, even though I've made that adjustment in the render settings. But I don't want to make it brighter than that. I think I'm going to go and add a little bit of additional base lighting here so that I can see that. But yeah, so Eevee helps you work, and it's almost the same character, but you can see that the walls show up much better than they do in Cycles. So in Cycles we have something that looks much darker. So keep that in mind as you work. So you can't really rely on what Eevee tells you is going to come out on the final image, but it's sort of okay if you, as you work with it. So what I recommend is you always have an eye on what does a real rendered image look like here. So I'm going to be switching back and forth between that until I'm ready to make final render adjustments. I'm going to go back to Eevee now, and in fact I'm going to go back to my first viewport shading option, which is this gray viewport shading here. I'm going to bring in my character sort of over here, and then we'll go set that up.